back. This is going to be a wonderful, wonderful session. It's called Citizen Solution, Redefining Leadership. And over the course of conversations in these past day and a half, everybody's been talking about redefining this and redefining that, but the truth is we're all after the same thing, and that is positive global social change. So whatever you're focused on, whatever you're thinking about, something is at the center of what we all want to achieve, and what is at the center is leadership. We've just heard, I think, a wonderful, wonderful conversation with Darren Walker about the way he's approached his leadership. And I think what really stayed with me is where he started, that human dignity, human values, human capital is absolutely fundamental to the change we try to create. So with that in mind, we want to really frame this session around values-based leadership. I had a wonderful conversation with some colleagues over lunch where we were talking about the value chain of social change and how we put the values chain into that value chain. And I think that's very, very true to the kind of leadership we want to talk about today. Some of you understand we're not talking about titles or positions of authority. We're talking about something much more deep and fundamental. You probably all saw, or many of you probably saw, David Brooks' column the other day, which speaks to this kind of leadership we want to explore in this session. It begins by recognizing that leadership is a passionate activity. It begins, Brooks writes, with a warm gratitude toward that which you have inherited and a fervent wish to steward it well. It is propelled by an ardent moral imagination, a vision of a good society that can't be realized in one lifetime. It is informed by seasoned affections, a love of the way certain people concretely are, and a desire to give all a chance to live at their highest level. This kind of leader is warm-blooded and leads with full humanity. Kicking off what I hope will be a warm-blooded conversation about leadership is Hakeem Belo-Osagie. He's the chairman of Emerging Markets Telecommunication Services Ltd, and for more than 3 decades has been a key player in the Nigerian economy through his participation in several businesses in the energy, finance, and telecommunications sector. Now, I was going to say something about what his remarks would really focus on, but I've been informed that he never follows the script. So here to surprise us all and to bring us some warm-blooded insights about leadership, Hakeem.
Thank you very much indeed for those very kind and frank remarks. I would start by saying that given we are approximately 10 minutes away from Palo Alto, the site of a certain famous business school, I am deeply honored that a Harvard Business School student like me is invited all the way from Lagos, Nigeria, to give a lecture on leadership. I am, however, at the same time humble, because the business school community has not always had the greatest respect or given sufficient attention to the non-profit world. And given that the business school community was largely responsible for the collapse of the financial markets several years ago, I therefore approach this talk on leadership with due humility. Do not believe everything I say, because our track record has not in the last couple of years been exceptional. I will confirm what the gracious lady said by saying that when I heard that I was going to speak about value-led leadership, my view was that all leadership is based on values, some values explicit, some values implicit. But since there's no such thing as leadership that is not value-based, of what point is there my speaking on value-based leadership? I therefore decided that I would just speak on leadership as I see it. I would not try to redefine leadership as I have been asked to do so, because my view is that the basic principles of leadership over thousands of years have not fundamentally changed. And that when I read about the great leaders of Rome, or in China, or great Islamic leaders in Nigeria, or the great business titans in the United States, or the great social leaders, the basic principles that they have enunciated as having guided them have been more or less similar. There are certain timeless issues that come up whenever you talk about or discuss the issue of leadership. So I will not therefore redefine leadership, but I will simply instead try to extract from my own experience some aspects of leadership that I want to lay before you and that I hope you will find interesting and hopefully thoughtful. Leadership is clearly crucial. If you examine the differences or the performances between various countries, whether you compare Singapore with Nigeria, you compare Brazil with Mexico, you compare the United States with the Soviet Union, you compare along organizations, you compare along universities, you compare along hospitals, you keep going back to the same issue over and over again. That what explains the success of one as opposed to the failure of the other is leadership. So I believe that we are focusing on the right thing in talking about leadership today. I have tried to distill my experience into 6 main categories. I'm not trying to write a new book. I'm sure you've all heard of the book, 48 Laws of Power. So this is not intended to be Keem's 6 Laws of Leadership. But that said, I've tried to make it concise and put it down into 6 key points that I believe are fundamental to great or good leadership. The first, for me, is what I would describe as the driving dream. All great leaders start with a driving dream. And in this respect, I think I echo her when she talks about leadership being passionate. Now, I talk about not just a dream, but I talk about a driving dream. That is something that makes you wake up every day and say to yourself, this is what I must do. This is what I want to do. This is what I cannot live without doing. And I talk about a dream as something different from a goal or a mission statement well crafted by the corporate affairs department of your company. It is something that is exciting. It is something that lifts you up. And it's something that answers the old saying. Some people ask the question, why? I dream of things that never were, and ask, why not? And that is what your dream must encapsulate. And all great leaders, whether it's in small companies, in hospitals, start with that driving dream. There are 3 things that often go wrong with these dreams, and I would like to share with you my view of them. 1, for many, and for leaders who do not get to the stage of being great leaders, their dreams are far too personal. A driving dream must be a dream of something that goes beyond the individual. It is linked to the community and is linked to something larger than the specific individual. For too many, your dream simply should not or cannot be, I simply wish to get to the top of the organization I'm in, and then I'm satisfied, and then I ask the question, what do I do next? that is clearly not a dream. It must be a dream that you truly feel, not something that you simply mouth, but great leaders have that passion, and you feel it in them when they talk about their dream. And if anything, I would say that most of my life, if I have a criticism of many leaders, it is that their dreams have not been ambitious enough. That is, that their concept of what are the limits of what are possible, in fact, have been far more modest than they ought to have been. So I talk a lot, or I believe a lot, in a grand driving dream as the first prerequisite of leadership. The second is the recognition that all great leaders require and only succeed with great core teams. And that whenever you look at a person and you think he's an awfully great leader, surely behind him or with him or her are a group of people with complementary talents, with skills, many of which he or she does not possess, and that forms the team that delivers his success. All great leaders have teams which they collaborate with, which are diverse, which are multi-talented, and given the complexity of the problems that we have right now, the days in which you had a single leader operating by himself are gone. The leader's second great requirement is the formation of that outstanding team. The third aspect that I have found crucial in my experience comes to the issue of communication. And that is, great leaders need to be able to tell in very simple terms a story about the past that unifies those that he hopes to lead, that explains to people what are the requirements of the present, and can therefore tell them in simple and very clear and catching terms where they need to go. Absent that communication, absent that simply told story, elements of the story often are myths, but that does not make them any less powerful or any less important. Some leaders, and I don't think this is the occasion to start mentioning names, who technocratically have been outstanding leaders, have failed because of that inability to communicate a story that binds, a story that brings people together. In Africa, where I come from, part of that storytelling, which is so crucial, is a story that explains why our religious, our ethnic, and our gender differences are not fundamental, and why, in fact, there is more that unites us than divides us. Fourth aspect for me is that great leadership demands that you be able to outline those day-to-day concrete steps that you need to take today that allows you to reach or to get to the dream that you have elaborated to your public. These are answers to the question, what is to be done? And these often require difficult compromises. Without the concrete steps that you need to take, there is the ever-present danger that your dream ends up just as a dream and nothing else. And great leaders have this ability to put together the concrete steps while at the same time never letting go the bigger dream that supports or that makes sense of those concrete steps. Sometimes many of these concrete steps are difficult steps. And what comes to mind was a saying of an old English writer, part comedian, Oscar Wilde, who often said that it may be true that we are all walking in a gutter, but some of us still have our eyes on the sun. The fifth is a psychological requirement. And that is, in my view, leadership requires not so much a sense of who the person is, but let me just say a sense of psychological security. That is that he or she has a sense of himself. That he or she are not completely driven by ego. And that because the goals and the dreams that they pursue and they wish others to pursue with them are more important than themselves as individuals, that they let go of those egotistical aspects and keep their minds firmly focused on the prize. A sense of security, which means an ability to listen to criticism, and at the same time, an ability to laugh at yourself from time to time. I think it is healthy, especially in these days, in which I would say some leaders, frankly speaking, need their heads examining. Finally, I would say that all the great leadership examples that I've come across have had a certain boldness, a certain inner confidence. But the best expression that I can think of that describes it is a Spanish expression. I will not impose my Spanish on you, but I will simply translate it into English. And it's the phrase lucid daring. Lucid daring. That is, to dare, but not to dare thoughtlessly, but still to dare. And all leaders need this quality because leadership involves walking with a group of people through what I think is best described as the fog of uncertainty. It is never the case that you will be able to see the path from beginning to end. I particularly enjoyed Darren Walker's speech before this because he accepted and admitted that there was no clear path that saw Mandela becoming president of South Africa. There was no clear path that could see from China's the Red Guard to where China is today. There was no clear path back in the 60s that saw a woman prime minister of Great Britain. But nonetheless, great leadership means that in that fog, when all is not clear, that you move forward, confident that you can tackle whatever problem comes before you. These 6 qualities, or these 6 points, for me, stand at the very center of leadership. When I look back, again, at my own life, I often ask the question, how are leaders created? How are they developed? I only have the following to say to you. By education, by example, and by early experience. It's entirely a coincidence that they all start with E, so this was no attempt by me whatsoever to try to come up with something catchy. But education, example, and early experience. All of us have young ones around us. In some cases, they may be children. In some cases, they may be students. In some cases, they may be younger people in the firms that we work in, that we mentor. The education that you impart to them, the example that you give them, and the experience that you also give them will determine whether they, in later life, will be great leaders. All of us, therefore, have that responsibility to do our very best, because great nations, great companies, great institutions are not created by one overwhelming leader. They are created by a million leaders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hakeem. They may not be Hakeem's laws, but maybe they should be. Wonderful, wonderful. Lucid, compelling, the dream, the practical steps. I think you've really given us a lot of good food for thought. But let's bring our other panelists up here now. Peter Eigen, who is the founder of Transparency International, has been working.
Very good to see you. Very good to see you.
Nice to see you. Peter has been working for decades in the arena of governance and transparency, one of the real forces in the social sector, and is chair of the Advisory Council at Transparency International today. Thank you so much for being here. Fred Swaniker is the founder of the African Leadership Academy, about which he'll tell us more, but absolutely committed to bringing forward the talent in Africa to lead its nations and its continent forward in the 21st century. So wonderful to have you here as well, Fred. We're going to proceed with a conversation rather than with seriatim statements from each of the panelists. And the first question is really designed to speak to that. I forget whether it was the third law of communication, but the ability to tell stories. I have a friend who referred to social entrepreneurs once as human tipping points, to get at the idea that they are actually trying to tip the world and the systems into a far better direction. But before one actually responds to that imperative, to that call to lead, one has his own personal or her own personal tipping point. So I would like to ask each of the panelists to recall that moment when she or he in this case, I guess, realized that he had to answer the call. If not me, who? If not now, when?
Well, if I talk about my case of leadership, which relates mainly to the founding of Transparency International, then the roots of my story began in Nairobi when I was the director of the World Bank for East Africa. And I noticed that everything the Africans were trying to do, everything we at the World Bank were trying to do, was undermined through corruption, through large-scale systematic corruption of the decision makers in Africa, and mainly by companies coming from Germany, from France, from the UK, from Canada, from Japan. I must say the US also had a few corrupt companies, but they had the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But what I found out later was that we in Germany, for instance, we allowed foreign bribery. And we even gave tax write-offs for it. So I wanted to do something about it. I said we have to have a systematic approach at the World Bank to not only protect our projects against corruption, but also to protect the people of Africa against this unholy alliance between promoters from the north who were trying through corruption to get contracts for bad projects and so on, and a local corrupt power elite. And therefore, I started to design a program like that, and I started to assemble a few people in a task force within the World Bank to develop this kind of systemic response to corruption. And I suddenly got a memorandum from the World Bank which said, you are not allowed to do this. This is not our policy. This is meddling in the internal affairs of our countries, and therefore you have to stop that immediately. And therefore I said I do it after office hours, and after 5 o'clock I fought corruption because I'm a citizen also of the World Bank, of the world. And then I got a memorandum of the president of the World Bank who said, what you're doing there is silly, it's unprofessional, it's embarrassing for us, it's illegal. As long as you're a director at the World Bank, you're not allowed to do this. Now, what a difference, from the position of the World Bank today, which we heard yesterday from Sanjay and today from Jim Kim. That was the situation, and I had to leave the World Bank if I wanted to continue this. And that formed in me this idea, I think you call it a burning dream, a dream to do something about it. It was partly idealism, it was partly also a sense of gamesmanship that I didn't want to accept this kind of thing. And that's how my path towards advocacy in the NGO sector started.
Spectacular tipping point. Thank you. Fred.
Let's try this again. There we go. Sally, as I think about this question, I reflect back on a quote that I once heard from Mark Twain that says, there are two important days in your life. The first is the day you're born, and the second is the day you find out why. And in my case, that day occurred about 11 years ago, actually not too far from here. At the time, I was at the Stanford Business School, and I was doing my MBA. And I'd just come back from a summer internship in Nigeria. And I came back and I was reflecting on this experience, and there were two things that confounded me that I just couldn't figure out why they were the way they were. The first was how a country with so much resource, they had billions of dollars of oil flowing through it for many decades before, and a population of 150 million, all these natural resources, how could that country be so poor? And without infrastructure and healthcare and everything, I couldn't understand what was going on. And it became clear to me, as I thought about that question more, that it really had been a failure of leadership at the highest and utmost level that had caused what the situation was in Nigeria. And so that was something that was in the back of my mind. The second experience I had during that summer internship was I had met several families in Nigeria who were making huge sacrifices to send their children to schools abroad. Some of them were paying $50,000, $60,000 a year to send their children from the age of 12 to schools in the UK. And so I was thinking, why are they making such big sacrifices to send their children abroad? Why don't we have schools of enough quality in Africa that can give them this alternative? And so as I thought about this more, I realized that actually perhaps this was what I need to do, is to help address these two issues. Why not build a school that could provide more, that would actually keep our young leaders in the country, but not just any school for education, but really something that would solve a bigger problem. And this issue of leadership had become clear to me that the single biggest issue we need to address, not just in Nigeria, but in Africa. Because the other thing, as I look back on my life, is I had grown up in different countries in Africa, and my family had been involved in starting several education institutions across different generations. And I thought, perhaps all these experiences had been preparing me to do this. That if this is what I could devote my life to, building institutions that could develop better leaders for Africa, then we could really help to transform the continent. And so that's what began my journey. And then 10 years later, that's what I've spent the last, my life doing.
Fantastic. What a story, what a journey, what promise. Hakeem, when did your driving dream become so driving that you had to pursue it?
I have to, first of all, compliment you, Fred, because your driving dream definitely came 10 to 15 years earlier than Peter and myself. So, but that is a testimony to how far you have come at such a young age, and I praise and compliment you for it. For me, it came in the late 80s. I think I was in my mid-30s then. I'd had a comfortable life in the oil business. I was in one of those very nice situations in which you find yourself being paid large amounts of money for giving advice that seems to you very simple and very obvious. And I just had this feeling that there was not enough. A couple of friends who I spoke to at the time said, Kim, you're saying that because that cash has not been cut off. When it gets cut off, you will appreciate this. But I felt very much that we're in the middle of a military regime. A lot of people, young people, such as myself, kept on saying that there are no opportunities to make changes. And so I got together with a group of young people like myself and said, look, if we can't change the political system of Nigeria, why don't we take a major institution that we can get hold of and make fundamental changes in that institution? Because the example of the changes that we make will reverberate and will set an example and affect many other institutions. I felt that in confronting that institution, trying to change it, would be confronting the basic political, economic, and social problems of Nigeria. But I wanted that we do it with a group of people who are all under 40, men and women, and cut across all the ethnic groups. And the opportunity that came was when they were selling some state-owned banks in Nigeria. I barely passed my accounting at business school, and I hated finance. So frankly speaking, there was no reason why I should have picked it. But that was the opportunity that was there, and I was driven by the challenge of reforming that institution. We got into the middle of the reform program, and then it hit me for the first time that once you try to reform, what happens is that you get enormous pushback by all of those people who are affected by it. And after that, I put on my desk a little saying by Machiavelli: there's nothing that is more difficult than to institute than the creation of a new order of things. For the reformer has enemies by all of those who benefited from the previous order and the uncertain support of those who may benefit from the new order. My tipping point came at the point at which the unions had taken over my head office and locked me out. I was under investigation by the military government. My plans for computerization had been stopped on the grounds that it was going to cause unemployment, and the bank was losing money. And I woke up one day and said to myself, maybe that easy money is not such a bad idea as I thought. But I pressed on, motivated by, I think, one of the things that you have said, which was, you decide you're going to go into reform, and then you ask yourself the question, if not me, who? If not now, when? And you ask yourself the question that if you come from a privileged background, if you have a great education, then surely it is on people like you that the burden of this struggle must be borne. That was my tipping point, and I'm happy that I went ahead and did not turn back. But I'll be honest and tell you, it was a close run thing.
Well, I think you're seeing here exemplars of what I call social entrepreneurship, what we call social entrepreneurship at the Skoll Foundation. These are people who have identified a system that needs to be changed. They're not working on the margins. They're working to disrupt, right what's wrong, and change the whole game. Picking up on one point you said about the pushback, that's one of the reasons, that's one of the ways you know you're involved in systems change. Gandhi said, first they mock you, first they ignore you, then they mock you, then they fight you, and then you win. So with that, I think we'd like to open it up to the audience to get some interaction going. I had, of course, 2 more questions to ask folks, but I think our bias here is to try to get some audience interaction. So if we can invite you all to ask your questions to one or more of the panelists, I think they'll be very excited to address what's of interest to you.
Daniel Holmesley with the City and County of San Francisco. For me, doing work in neighborhoods around resilience, one of the catalysts we have found that has been really a substantive X factor is the caliber of leadership that's embedded in that neighborhood. And looking at the functional areas that sort of make up that leadership, the ability to organize, create transparent governance, resource manage, those types of things. And I'm just trying to understand how you feel we can really uptick the caliber of leadership in our communities, regardless, I think, of the education piece. So I think life affords everyone an amazing education, regardless if you ever sit at a desk. But I want to know what you see in the world as the viable option to create a uniform standard for capacity in our communities, regardless if it's in the US or in Kenya, and how we can start to create some kind of a baseline that we can all work with as we begin to push programs out in order to get more of a consistent level of penetration and traction in these communities. Because I really feel like that's the variable that we deal with. The same program in 2 neighborhoods can have 2 very different outcomes, and often it's because of the ability of the neighborhood to lead around that opportunity.
Someone want to address this community-based leadership? Peter?
Well, I mean, he is referring particularly to local government, to the government in urban areas, in urban regions. And my reaction to this question would be, first of all, get rid of corruption in the political leadership and give a sense to the community that there is no corruption. Then you will get better people to apply for work with you. You get a more vigilant civil society which will work with you to observe and to point out to you what is wrong in your society. And gradually you build up an island of integrity where you get better people and better citizens and see good results, because it is, in my opinion, corruption in many parts of the world that big cities are poorly planned, that wrong decisions are taken about many of the aspects of good urban life. And you will not be surprised that I sort of have a one-track mind, Good governance in a city creates good governance. And that, of course, needs leadership. It needs a leadership which has perhaps these 6 elements which Hakeem has mentioned. But in addition, this kind of leadership has to have a commitment to work together with the government, with the citizens, with civil society, and with the private sector. It's this sort of magical triangle of interaction which allows you to diagnose the problems and find solutions together, monitor the implementation together, and enjoy the results together. So this is sort of my mantra, a magical triangle interaction, and this is, I guess, is the theme of this whole conference. The cooperation, maybe an antagonistic operation of independent partners between government, civil society, and the private sector. And that I can recommend practically to every local government, to every urban situation, in fact to every sectoral situation, if you are able to organize this kind of interaction.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I
yes, of course, Hakeem.
One little point I would just like to add. I'm not sure that it addresses directly what you're saying, but I find that you can't get away from the fact that most, if not all leaders, are in a sense prepared by others for their positions. That they're prepared, yes, partly by their education, but they're also prepared by being advised, being mentored, and being thrown into some low-risk situations that allow them to exercise their judgment, to make decisions, and allow them to learn. And that any society, any community must have a way in which this preparation takes place systematically, so that individuals who have been prepared in this way can then lead the kinds of initiatives that you speak about. I look at my life and I can think of 2 people who prepared me, and I can't imagine that I would have succeeded when the challenge came if I hadn't had that preparation.
You'd probably agree with that, wouldn't you, Fred?
Yes, very much so. But I think that one thing that we should be careful about, I mean, one of the points you made was, or I guess questions you're raising, is about the lack of consistency between one, part of one town and another and so forth. And I think that, to Hakeem's point about the importance of having a driving dream, I really believe that great leaders need to have something that they are personally very passionate about. You cannot impose that onto someone. And so, for example, when I look at the young leaders that we're developing at the African Leadership Academy, people say, are you trying to develop political leaders or business leaders? I say, we are trying to develop leaders in all fields. We want to find people who have certain passions and really nurture that passion, because that's when true great leadership happens, where someone comes with their dream and then they drive towards it. And therefore, as you think about, having consistency across different cities and so forth, I'm not sure that that's actually what is best for society, because that is something that then would be imposed from top down, rather than finding people who are really passionate and have a dream for that community and supporting those people to get into positions of leadership and then letting those dreams flower and bloom. And I think if you have that, then you'll have truly great outcomes versus trying to impose a standard dream across all of them.
Interesting point. Yes, there.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your intimate stories of daring to dream. They're very inspirational. Marilyn Blucher on Global Health Systems and Philanthropy. This is a very exciting year and an important year in terms of the transition between Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals. A lot's about to happen. And there's also the economic situations in now low middle income countries and opportunity for public-private partnerships, which we've talked about the last 2 days. I'm curious as to each of your thoughts on if you were the leader, what you would specifically do in terms of global governance to ensure transparency, to ensure ethical arrangements between governments and private sector, so all sides, including civil society, benefit from the coming possibilities.
Okay, so if you were king of the world, how would you organize things?
I think I'll pass the king of the world title to Fred.
Well, if you,
Peter,
I feel we are presently faced with governance failure in the globalized economy. We are still following a paradigm of governance which is based on nation states, on their governments, on their international institutions, and we forget that you cannot introduce what we call in Germany a soziale Marktwirtschaft, a social market economy, without proper governance in an economy which is worldwide. And it is quite clear that national governments have lost this capacity. They don't have the geographical reach, They don't have the time horizon. I mean, in particular, in democracies, politicians have to maintain power every 3, every 4, every 5 years, while many of the global issues we have to deal with have a much longer time horizon. They don't have a constituency which has the same ideas, the same values, which have to drive a proper global governance. So in many ways, nation states have lost their capacity to introduce a coherent global governance which is fair and which is just. And the result is 1 billion people under the poverty line, 2 billion people without sanitation, child mortality high, conflicts and death and destruction in many parts of the world, in particular in Africa. So I feel we are faced with governance failure in our new time. Therefore, who can step in? And you talked about private-public partnership. These are only two actors. Too often they are in cahoots with each other. Too often the private sector tells the government what to do. When in Germany, for instance, we are not allowed to stop our companies from bribing outside Germany because our companies would tell the government that then they would lose jobs, they would lose billions of dollars of contracts worldwide. And therefore, and it's very same, if you look at the new lobbying rules and so on here in the United States and so on, it's quite clear that this pair, private-public, is very good for funding projects together and so on, but they are not good for dealing with governance. For governance, you need 3 players. And one of these players has to be organized civil society. And that's what I saw in the fight against corruption, where the 3 of us were able to introduce the enabling environment for introducing the OECD Convention Against Bribery. It was the driving force for the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which tries to introduce a modicum of good governance in oil and gas and minerals and so on. It's these 3 players, and they can do it everywhere if civil society grows into this role. If they have competence, professional competence, if they have good governance themselves. Many civil society organizations are miserable themselves in terms of governance. I mean, after all, the Ku Klux Klan is an NGO. So it is wrong to always think that civil society is per se good. Civil society has to learn to cooperate with the other 2 actors. In the United States, there are many NGOs which think it's a deadly sin to accept money from the government. In other societies, people say you never take money from the private sector because you lose your integrity, your credibility. We at Transparency International, we take money from everybody, just for you to know. As long as we can maintain our independence, and that you have to do through particular structural arrangements in civil society. But if these challenges are met in civil society, I think this combination of 3 is magic, and they can deal with global governance. And we have seen this in many areas, whether it's human rights, whether it's environmental destruction, whether it is fighting corruption. And this is sort of why I'm so enthusiastic about it, why I have this driving dream.
Well, I think the point you make about the 3 sectors, the Venn diagram, optimal relationship among them, still begs the question of leadership and how we actually advance the kinds of leaders in each of those sectors to be able to reap the benefits of that intersectoral paradigm for leadership. One of the directions I believe the SDGs are going is, to your point about nation states, is looking at more subnational units to drive the next agenda of development goals. So it's two challenges there, I think, really, the fragmentation of the world, despite these large players, and then the challenge of ethical leaders to actually broker the kinds of arrangements that will serve humanity and the future of the planet. So big questions out there. And then I'd add also the 4th estate. The media really has to be robust, because civil society and the media really have to go hand in hand. So do we have another question? Jan?
I think we all do, the leadership paradigm that was laid out, and I wonder if you would, I was thinking that maybe boards should use it to evaluate leadership, but I wonder if you would speak to 2 points in it. You talked about the fog, and I wonder if each of you, could you say a little to us about some of those foggy times and how you navigate through them? And then also, I like the dimension, because often in leadership we overlook the everyday, but it was talked about how do you make the decisions about how we spend our time. And I wonder if each of you could comment about how do you make those choices about how you use your time, your team's time?
Mm-hmm.
Who wants to take up fog and time?
About Born?
Fog, the fog of uncertainty. I think how you make
Oh,
decisions
navigate.
in uncertainty, and then the issue of how you spend your time and make decisions in an optimal way. Maybe Fred, we haven't heard from you recently.
Well, it depends very much in which area a civil society I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought your microphone didn't work.
How you navigate through the fog. I think the way I like to think about it is always there's a case about the prisoners of war who were in Vietnam, who studies were done, and there were certain people who survived and made it through after being kept in prison for so long, and those ones who died. And one of the things they found was that the ones who died always thought that they were going to be let out the next day. And they had these dreams that were unrealistic in some ways, right? And so, but the ones who survived had a hope that they would one day make it, but also were quite realistic about the difficulties and the challenges that would take to go through and make it. And so, when I found in the various situations when I've had lots of uncertainty, is to really go back to that driving dream and the vision and say, what are we trying to achieve? But not be unrealistic about all the difficulties and challenges that we're actually going to have to go through to get to that big goal. Because the minute you understand all of those obstacles, then you start making plans. And that goes back to your day-to-day, saying how do you now overcome obstacle 1, obstacle 2, obstacle 3. And so it's important to have big dreams, but then back that up with very realistic sense of what are going to be the challenges to get there. So that's how I would deal with that.
Hakeem?
If I can, this idea of the fog of uncertainty, I started focusing very much on that idea as a result of 2 things. One was speaking to business school students who would come back to Nigeria and explain their frustrations with me. And their frustrations always, they would run along the following lines. I just don't have enough data to take a decision. I just can't get that feasibility study written. And my response would be that when Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company in the United States, I'm not sure that he had a complete feasibility study on hand. Okay? And therefore, the fog is the realization that decisions must be taken, notwithstanding the fact that you do not have all the facts, and that you must be agile, you must be flexible as things come before you and you react. That was one. The second, and here please don't jump on me if I declare my political affiliation, is a lovely DVD that I recommend to people to watch. It's a DVD interview of a Secretary of Defense I do not mean Rumsfeld. I mean Robert McNamara.
Yeah, right. I know that one.
And the DVD is entitled The Fog of War. And in that DVD, he talks in a haunting, agonized voice. And this is a man of supreme brilliance and intelligence, reflecting over some of the mistakes he may have made. But I don't think it's right to condemn him because he's talking about making decisions in the fog of war. And that expression, I must say, came to me. And as I started to think about it, there's a fog of uncertainty in all decisions that we take. It means that we must not be doctrinal, we must not be certain about everything we do, but we must still make the decision nonetheless. That's why that fog is so important for me to realize that it is normal and it is something that we must walk through.
If I can add one more thing to that, I think that let's not forget the importance of a gut. You know, I think that
Importance of
a gut.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, when you're in that fog, I've found before I became a social entrepreneur, I was with McKinsey, and I remember we would spend months and months getting data after data after data to make a relatively simple decision that we would then go and present to the client. And you know, when I became an entrepreneur, we didn't have time and we didn't have the clarity, we didn't have access to this data. We had to make decisions with a lot of uncertainty. So we would do our best to gather input from various sources and everything. But at a certain point, then I have to say, okay, what does my gut tell me that we should be doing? Mm-hmm. And then you need to act. And there's also the importance of, I think one thing that can happen when you're caught in that fog is that you get paralyzed and you don't act. And you wait and wait and wait and see how can we get more information. And I think that, you know, one thing I've learned is better to act with your gut and then fix it later than not to act at all. That has always been, I've found, a better decision than just waiting until you have all the facts and until all the uncertainty is gone.
Yeah, let's stay with this for a minute, though, because I don't know how many of you have read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, but we all make decisions and we all gravitate towards solutions based on biases. And it's very important for us to be aware of and understand our biases. And so at the same time, there's an intuition that we learn to trust because it's informed intuition. Those biases are really critical. So how do each of you ensure that you have around you people who will tell you the truth, people who will actually encourage you to do something other than what you may think is the right, the brilliant, the advised thing to do?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I can give you an example which sheds a negative light on me as a leader. But I had at the very beginning, after we started Transparency International, an intern who was writing his doctor's thesis. He was an economist. He wanted to quantify everything. So he said, I would like to measure corruption. And therefore, I'm developing parameters so that I can quantify it, because only then can we economists deal with this thing. You know, otherwise, it is just fog. And I said, this is nonsense. You know, I had worked for 25 years in the World Bank. I had all these economists all over me. The numbers were coming out of my ears. I thought I don't need to have this kind of attempt in my office. In fact, this is why Susan Rose Ackerman once called me a thoughtless activist. But he continued to do this work, and since an intern doesn't cost a lot of money, I let him continue. But then he also talked to the press.
Your World Bank training certificate.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. He talked to the media, and they promised him they would never publish this. And he told them he had a ranking of corruption. He called it the Corruption Perception Index. 54 countries, he said, but please don't publish it. And the Monday afterwards, it was in Der Spiegel in Germany, and I got phone calls from the Wall Street Journal and so on, that how did you do this? This is fantastic. So I had to... I had to decide, do I disown this and say this is some stupid academic who is working with me, or should I go with it and say, yes, this is work in process? And as many of you know, this became our most powerful instrument for changing the awareness of the people. I mean, our corruption perception index is really a byproduct of our work, but it is incredibly effective. And I'm happy that nobody listened to me at the time. And the reason was that I had learned to participatory management. It was not so much governance, it was participatory management, which we learned at the World Bank. And you listen to the people who know more about this stuff than yourself, even if you are hierarchically above them. And therefore, we designed the whole Transparency International, also in terms of its governance, as a democratic institution. We have over 100 national chapters. They elect our board. Our board looks over the work of our management. And we have now 180 staff members in Berlin who are helping these 100 national chapters everywhere in the world. And we can claim that we have some democratic legitimacy. But most importantly, I think we are open to advice, and therefore what we produce is accepted. And I think people would call that output legitimacy, which gives you the strength to go out with data and with criticism and with judgments about societies and so on, which you would otherwise not dare to do. But I think it's a very important issue, and I must say I felt very comfortable in the World Bank, where you have a whole bureaucracy. You can ask the experts. If you want to do a little livestock project in Central African Republic, you have 10 different units. You can ask them whether what you are proposing is right. But when you are a civil society activist, in particular in the beginning, where we were only 3-4 people working out of my garage, you feel very lonely. And then you need exactly the guts that you are talking about. And I would say it's also an art. It's not only sort of an instinct. I mean, that's what guts implies. It's also an art to try to do the right thing. And you make mistakes. I mean, McNamara admitted that he made tremendous mistakes in the Defense Department. And later in the World Bank, he did very well, I think. Mm-hmm. And after the World Bank, he did even better. So I'm glad that you reminded me of that case, because it's the same man with the same intelligence, the same brilliance and so on, who made huge mistakes, in particular as far as his work as Minister of, or Secretary of Defense is concerned. But then later, working for the public good, he was tremendously wise and courageous and insightful, a real leader.
Yeah.
If I could just add, I find that it's not just the problem of getting people who can stand up to you and disagree with you. That I find personally not so difficult to do. But it's a deeper problem, and that is that you tend to select your closest advisors to be people who look like you, think like you, behave like you, and have the same world view. Mm-hmm. Therefore, when they disagree with you, and you feel good that you've accepted their disagreement, it tends to be issues that are really on the margin. And it takes a lot to have people around you, or close to you, or in your organization that are fundamentally different from you in their approach. Because it's jarring, and they're difficult, and they challenge your basic assumptions. And so therefore, I think the challenge is to have people like that with you, and to give them a space within the organization. In such a manner that they don't become the in-house dissenter. That is the person who's allowed to make his comment before everybody goes on to the decision that they've already agreed to reach. But that you utilize them in challenging your assumptions. That's the challenge.
Great.
From my perspective, what I try to do is there are three things that I think, but first I completely agree that how critical it is for leaders to be told the truth. And the three things that I try to do and that I believe can help in this case. One is the elimination of fear. And how do you celebrate people and instances where someone has disagreed with you and that led to a better outcome? And holding those people up as heroes in the organization so others realize that it's actually okay to disagree with the leader and that is actually expected and celebrated. And the second thing that I try to do is to hire people that are much smarter than myself and to surround myself with people who are smarter than myself. And also, that relates to what Kim was talking about in terms of finding people who are different from you. But one of the things, really finding people who bring so much to the table that you can't help but be swayed by their logic. And then the third thing I believe it's really important is to create institutions. And I think a lot about this because I think one of the things that, especially in Africa, we fail to do is we start a lot of projects that are very dependent on one or two people, but we don't build institutions that are enduring on their own without a given leader. So I really believe that it's important for a leader to go into any setting to see themselves with a time limit, that I'm here to expire myself after my work is done. And if you do that, that means you will be building institutions and passing and disempowering yourself slowly over time and giving responsibility to others in the organization and giving them real empowerment so that they can make decisions. And give them a chance to challenge you and tell you the truth.
I think that's a really profound note to close on. One of my favorite quotes is Jean Monnet, who's the architect of the EU, who said, "Nothing changes without individuals. Nothing lasts without institutions." And I think all great leaders are really hard at the work of building enduring institutions. We're going to be transitioning to a musical interlude to help get people in another frame of mind to transition to the working groups. And we want to thank our panelists, I think, for a tremendous job. I was privileged years ago to be at a conversation with three great leaders, as great as the three up here, who were asked for very short and very concise advice as to their definitions of leadership. And Archbishop Tutu was the first one to speak. One word: care. Back to your driving dream. Mary Robinson was the second. She said, include others. Gru Brundtland, the third, she said, think long term. I think you have up here three exemplars of leadership who care, who think long term, and who include others in everything they do. Another hand, please.